Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quorum Podcast. This is where academic medicine meets remote, austere, and resource-limited areas. Today, we talk with Tim Cranton, who is our Year 1 Bachelor's of Remote Paramedic Practice Advisor. Tim, can you introduce yourself? Tell us about your background, your qualifications, the current job you're in, and what are you doing now?
So, my name is Tim Cranton, and I'm one of the professional practice advisors for the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine Foundation. I'm also mentor to the first years of our BSc program in remote paramedic practice, and you'll find me in Malta teaching them as well when they're doing some of their modules. I'm ex-British Army combat medic, and I'm also qualified as an HCPC paramedic, so registered in the UK. And I spent some time in the fire service as well, so I've got a mixed background when it comes to both medical and rescue. I did my training to be an offshore medic, over 20 years ago now. So I've been an offshore medic for quite a while. And I'm currently working as an offshore medic with a company called United Healthcare, and I'm on the Shell Brent Charlie. So the Brent Charlie is actually one of the last remaining of the Shell Brent oil platforms. So this installation has been here about 45 years now, and is currently being decommissioned. So I've only got a couple of trips left here, but I'm looking forward to transferring over to a new project, which will be a floating production facility. But as it stands, I am currently the offshore medic and healthcare professional, HCP they prefer to call it now, on the Shell Brent Charlie.
Tim, why did you become an offshore medic?
So I became an offshore medic because it seemed like a natural progression in terms of my career. So I left the British Army, and I actually went to work in Iraq and Kuwait, and I was doing bomb disposal for a couple of years. So we are looking at the early 90s. So October 91, I came out of the army. And as I said, I did 2 years, or roughly 2 years, maybe a bit more in Kuwait and Iraq. And after I'd done that, I kind of got back to the UK, and it was a question of deciding, what was I going to do next? Obviously, there's bills to pay, and I think that's one of the main motivations for most people is you're looking to transfer your skill set into something that has due reward. And certainly for me at the time in the early 90s, after doing some research, it made a lot of sense for me to move into that kind of environment because it was very similar to what I was already used to in the military. So I made some inquiries and found out about offshore medic training, and went ahead and did my offshore medic course. And at the time, I was also working as a paramedic with a private ambulance company. So I was able to kind of finance myself through it at that point. I actually took a loan from my mother-in-law. She did help me when it came to getting on that first course. But the main motivation was I needed something that was going to be a place where I could utilize my current skill set, and that was the skill set that I had from the military. And working offshore as a medic was the natural choice.
That's pretty interesting. I've been wondering, how long have you been working offshore?
So in terms of working offshore, as I said earlier, I left the army in around October of 1991, and then I did 2 years, 2 and a bit years in Kuwait and Iraq doing contract work. And this was clearing up spent munitions after the first Gulf War. And when I came back to the UK, I needed a job, so I went offshore, did all my qualifications, did my survival, firefighting, etc. And so I will have been offshore since 1994. So it's quite a long time. It's over 20 years, put it that way.
Tim, I've never been on an oil rig. I've never worked offshore, and I'm sure there's quite a few people in our bachelor's degree program who are looking for a job, their first job or eventual job, and working in the offshore. What is it like? What's the day to day? What is your experience? What is it like working as an offshore medic?
Well, that's a good question. An offshore medic is not just a medic. I guess an offshore medic is a mixture of quite a lot of things. Essentially, an offshore medic is the responsible person on board an offshore installation that's usually working within the oil and gas industry. And the main job of the medic is to provide emergency healthcare services and general healthcare services to everybody that's on board that installation. But at the same time, we are usually the occupational health focal point. So we're going to be looking after our crew in terms of any occupational health exposures that they might have. So that may be noise, excessive noise, that could be chemicals, hand-arm vibration. There are a number of things that can affect your health whilst working offshore. So we're the focal point for those things as well. In saying that, in my time, I've also done radio op, I've also done helicopter administration, and I've also been the safety advisor as well. So an offshore medic is a mixture of jobs, but primarily there to look after the healthcare needs of all people on board the installation. Depending on the number of people, it will usually depend on how many medics there is, but I look after a crew of around 150 people. Most recently with COVID, we've had two medics on, so we've had days and night shift, but it's usually one medic for around 150 to 200 people.
Tim, how would a paramedic would want to work in the oil rig or a ship or offshore location? How would they go about getting their first job? How do you get started in this?
So to answer that question, I think if you ask where do you start, um, networking is probably the place where you start. So if you're interested in any kind of training courses or working in remote medicine, I think asking your peers or asking people that you work with is usually a good start. And of course, Google is usually the best one, I think, nowadays, is getting yourself online, doing a broad Google search and asking, how do I become an offshore medic? There's an awful lot of information out there that will tell you what you can and I guess what you cannot do. But I would say ask people like myself. I have no issues with anybody dropping me a line at my college email. Ask anyone else that you know who's an offshore medic, obviously. But no, get yourself on the internet, get on Google and literally type in, how do I become an offshore medic? That's usually a good place to start. And then once you've done that, really what you need to do is go through testimonials, I guess, and see what feedback people have given about courses they have done, who they've done those courses with, and what successes they have had in terms of employment. Because you always want to know if you're going to a good training provider or not, and there are some good ones out there, and there's some, I won't say bad ones, but there are some that won't necessarily give you what you need. I would argue that companies like Icarus and Nottingham Hospitals, NHS Trust, they're probably the big two in the UK in terms of providing offshore medic training. But getting on those courses is not easy because they're usually booked up pretty far ahead. But the company that I work for, United Health, we do our training with Nottingham Hospitals. And the reason we're doing it with Nottingham Hospitals is because the tickets that they provide, the certifications, are recognized within the kind of civilian world. So you're going to get your advanced cardiac life support, you're going to get your pre-hospital trauma life support certification within those courses. Go to a training provider and ask them questions. And ask them about, what are the prospects of getting employed. There are also a lot of companies out there. United Healthcare is obviously one of them. Icarus, again, is another one, who actually provide medics offshore. And you'll find that they will obviously have their web pages as well. And they'll have recruitment usually on their web pages, so you can search them. Failing that, you can write to them, email them, or you can pick up the phone and call them. And ask them, tell them that you're interested in becoming an offshore medic and where's the best place to start. There's actually some companies now that will provide the training to you. So they'll get you through your offshore medic course, they'll get you through your survival course and your medical. But obviously there's a catch, and the catch is essentially that you are going to be held to that company and their employ for a number of years, so 2-3 years, in order to pay back essentially their investment in you. I guess there's going to be good and bad things with that. Some people might not want to be held to one single entity, but certainly for guys that are starting out and want to get their foot in the door, it's actually not a bad option. And there's a couple of people that I've spoken to that have gone down that route, and they've done pretty well, and they've managed to get themselves offshore. They've worked back the time they owed to the company, and they're doing really well. Yep, if you want to be an offshore medic, get yourself on the internet, start speaking to people, drop us a line, and we'll give you a heads up.
How did you get your first job in the offshore industry?
So I got my first job offshore not long after I'd done my offshore medics course. During doing the training, and I did it with a company called Medicos in Hull, and there's offshore oil and gas in Norwich, so we have what we call the Southern Basin, and that's where you'll have a lot of gas platforms that are offshore Norwich and Great Yarmouth, that particular area. And because it was local to me in that I lived in Peterborough in Cambridgeshire at the time, getting there was kind of easier than going all the way up to Scotland. So I did my course there, and that kind of got me in touch with companies that employed offshore medics. But what I actually did is I bought myself a train ticket, and I went up to Aberdeen with my freshly printed offshore medics ticket. I did my survival and everything, and obviously I paid that myself at the time. I booked myself into a bed and breakfast for 2-3 days, and I had a list of companies, offshore employers that employed offshore medics, and I literally turned up at their reception and I said, "My name is Tim Cranton. I'm a newly qualified offshore medic. Do you have any offshore medic jobs? I can go today." And essentially that's kind of how I got my first job. I literally went around a load of companies, and whilst unfortunately I didn't go offshore within the 2 to 3 days, the following week when I was at home, I got a phone call to go back up to Aberdeen for an interview, and within the space of I think 2 weeks, I was actually working offshore. So I got my first job by getting on a train, putting my feet in people's in trays, in companies' in trays, saying, "I'm available for work right now. What have you got?" And literally a week later, I was called up for an interview, and I got a job within 2 weeks. And just to follow on from that question about how did I get my first job, so obviously a lot of companies are looking for people with experience, and it's very difficult to get your foot in the door if you don't have any experience. But one of the jobs that I actually interviewed for was working for a catering company. Now you think, why would a medic work for a catering company? Well, there was, at that particular time, um, the catering company was providing what they call life support services. So it wasn't just like stewards, catering crew, cooks, and stuff like that, and chefs. They were actually looking to include medics. So it was an overall what they call a facilities management concept. And at the time, I wasn't really bothered. What I wanted to do was make sure that I got my feet in the door and I got myself some offshore experience. So I actually took a job as the medic chief steward. And again, some of you who might even be offshore medics out there will probably be cringing when I'm saying that, because there are potential conflicts in that role, especially when it comes to hygiene, but you're also working for the catering company. And how could you work for the catering company if you have to do inspections and stuff like that? But as it was, it got me offshore. It got me my first job, which I did for about a year. And it was actually really good because I also got to learn at the same time an awful lot about facilities management and catering and doing things like hygiene inspections, and especially food hygiene and food safety. I learned an awful lot about that. And one of the things I've done since is, I've been sent on courses on food hygiene. But because I was already working for a catering company, they paid for all of those things for me as well. So it actually really helped when I decided to transfer over to another company to do something that was more health focused.
Tim, looking back over your career, what would you say is the most challenging medical case that you had on an offshore oil rig?
Okay, most challenging case. There's been quite a few challenging cases, and I guess it depends how you think of it. In a remote location, it's not just about the patient and having to manage the patient and their condition and their problems. It's the bigger picture, because it's not just about the patient. You have to be able to get the patient from the installation and get them somewhere else. So you're not only managing their medical problems, you're managing the logistical problem. To come back to that question, um, I have had several cases that were acute abdomens, and they've been challenging in that I've had patients in what I would describe as extreme discomfort with other clinical issues, being unwell, vomiting, um, severely dehydrated, in a lot of pain, and trying to get them comfortable so that I can, give a good examination and provide the correct treatment. But the other challenge has been able to get them off of the installation and also get to the right place. So one case in particular, I had a young patient I actually knew quite well, whose friend had brought him up to the sick bay. And this was quite late. I think it was around 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. And he was complaining of really bad abdominal pains. And this guy could not keep still. He just could not find a comfortable place to be able to put himself. So obviously getting him into the sick bay, trying to get him to a point where I could actually do a really good examination, was challenging in itself. Obviously, I'm trying to explain what I need to do, but I need to get access to him. I need to be able to do basic things like take his observations, like take blood pressures. But when you have a patient that won't keep still and won't settle, so is kind of combative, that can be a really challenging thing to manage. And I think what I ended up doing, and because it was an acute abdomen, I kind of went old school. And it's not just a question of getting IVs and things in your patient. It's talking to them, trying to get them to calm down, getting them to breathe. And once I kind of got him to a point where he was kind of a little bit more relaxed, I managed to get IV access. And once I got IV access, I gave him some pain medication to be able to treat the pain. That in itself settled him a little bit more. And then I boiled a kettle. I got a hot water bottle. I placed that on his abdomen and managed to settle him down even more. So that in itself, with a little bit of diversional therapy and the medication starting to work, actually controlled his pain. So I was able then to give him a good examination. Now, during the examination, I identified that he had rebound tenderness. So he was positive for McBurney's sign, etc. So I decided that this was not a patient that I wanted to stay and play with. It was obvious that I would need to evacuate this patient. And what I wanted to do was get him to the nearest medical facility so we could get a scan, so we could get ultrasound, etc., to be able to make a diagnosis, but potentially get him into surgery if that's what was needed. So as it was, what we ended up doing is we got a search and rescue flight. So again, I've got to get in touch with the installation manager. He in turn gets in touch with the Coast Guard. I have to have a call with my topside medical service, so I have to speak to the doctor, give him a full set of observations on my patient, tell him the circumstances so that he can then authorize the search and rescue flight. So that search and rescue flight on a good day, certainly to somewhere like the Brent Charlie, is going to take around 2 or 3 hours. And then obviously it will take that amount of time again to get them back to wherever it is they're going. But as it was, we managed to get search and rescue flight out. It took 3 hours to get search and rescue to the patient. Thankfully, by now, I've managed to get a good set of observations. I've managed to eliminate anything that might be immediately life-threatening. I've got good pain management on board. I'm using a hot water bottle and keeping my patient warm. And I'm essentially got my patient stable. Got him on an IV, but I'm TKVO. I'm not running any, massive amounts of fluids in the patient. He's not in shock or anything. And we got the doctor on board with a paramedic, and they took the patient back. And the patient, I think, went to Gilbert Bain. So that's one of the hospitals in the Hebrides. And because we're actually very north of the UK, so the Shetland Islands actually, so we're north of the Shetland Islands. So Gilbert Bain is one of the hospitals there, and the patient went into the hospital, but essentially by the time the patient had got into the hospital, his condition had settled. Now this was unbeknown to myself. I'd obviously tidied up and everything. I didn't get to bed, I don't think, probably until around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning by the time we'd got the patient away, and I tidied everything up, cleaned everything up. I don't think I'd been in my bed much more than an hour when I got a phone call from the radio operator saying the patient had been discharged from hospital, which I didn't know anything about because I didn't get any feedback. So in the end, what I ended up having to do between myself, the radio operator, and then people within my company is then try and manage a patient who was essentially marooned somewhere in the Shetland Islands, waiting or asking how he was going to either get back offshore or get home again. So the challenging part wasn't the medical part. The challenging part was actually all of the administration and the logistics to be able to get this patient where he needed to go. But when he actually got there, the hospital said they couldn't find anything. The patient had settled down, and he was discharged into the care of his own GP. But the patient didn't know what to do, so he literally turned up at the heliport asking, what should I do next? So then what we had to do is speak to the helicopter operator. We then had to arrange to get him on a flight back to Aberdeen. When he got to Aberdeen, he went to visit with his company physician, so we had to get him with a doctor. And then from Aberdeen, once he'd been given clearance from one of our occupational health physicians, he then went home. And in the end, I ended up seeing him when I came back from my next offshore trip, and he hadn't had a problem since. Question mark grumbling appendix, but they said he had ultrasounds, he had tests, various tests, and everything was okay. So my most challenging patient wasn't a medical one; it was the logistics to get him medevac, to get him seen, but after he was discharged, was actually to get him home back into the care of his own GP. Of course, there have been other challenging patients, certainly medically. With 20 odd years offshore, there's a significant number of patients I've obviously seen. I've had unconscious patients, an unconscious patient with a silent MI who was unresponsive, and we had to manage his airway and do some ventilation for him. Again, bring out RC rescue with the patient being ventilated or assisted breathing because his breathing rate was rather slow. But we managed him for a good hour or so before we managed to get the helicopter on board. That was offshore in Great Yarmouth. And the patient had a silent MI. He was taken to hospital and he was discharged several days later, and he fully recovered. Other ones offshore, I had a patient who was on a standby vessel. I was on the adjacent rig that the vessel, or should I say the guard vessel, was looking after. And it was one of the engineers. He was cleaning a fan. He managed to chop his fingers off when he stuck his fingers inside the fan, and unfortunately the fan hadn't been isolated, and it took his fingers away. But because he was on the ship, we couldn't obviously land a helicopter on board because of the sea state. It was moving around too much. So we lowered off one of our lifeboats to just above sea level, and the patient was put on a fast rescue craft. We did a transfer from the fast rescue craft into the lifeboat. We winched the lifeboat back up to the installation, where I obviously treated him inside the lifeboat and back up onto the installation. And then I treated him in the sick bay. We got RC rescue out, who were then able to land on board, and then transferred the patient over to there, and they took that patient in. I had another patient who was septic, again on another vessel. I was on a floating production vessel or tanker at the time, and we managed to get the patient to climb the sea ladder from a fast rescue craft, got him on board, and this guy was in an awful lot of pain. He was desperate to be seen by a medic. When I examined him, I could see that he was septic because he had tracking from an infection, a leg, a boil, basically, a cyst that he had on his leg. I got him on IV antibiotics, and again got him on an RC rescue helicopter and got him away. There's been a number of patients, and again, the most challenging is not necessarily the injury or the illness. It's actually been facilitating the rescue part and then getting them off to the installation to definitive care.
Tim, can you give me 2 pearls of wisdom for anyone wanting a career in remote medicine?
I think my first pearl is you need a good ground or base qualification. So if you are already qualified as a combat medtech, so you're in the military, or 68 Whiskey if you're in the US, a combat medic. So a military medic, a Navy medic, or an Air Force medic, that would be a really good kind of base qualification. And certainly in the UK, that would qualify you to do an offshore medics course. So you can't just have your nursing degree or your paramedic degree and then go offshore. There's other things that you're going to need. So like I said, my first pearl is you need a good base qualification that will give you the clinical skills that you need and the medical knowledge that you need that will then prepare you to go ahead and do an offshore medics course. If you don't have a good grounding in kind of general medicine and pre-hospital care, then most likely you won't be successful in gaining employment offshore and obviously getting through the offshore medics course. The second pearl is never stop learning. Certainly for me, I think when I left the army, and I needed to earn a good wage because I had a mortgage to pay, I had a young family and everything at the time, and as I said earlier, that was kind of my main motivation, was getting myself into a job that was going to be, going to have a good reward. You need to be well qualified, and to do that, you need to be well studied. But once you've done your study, never stop learning. So most certainly one of the things that's opened up opportunities for employment for me is the additional courses that I've done on top of my base qualification. So as I said, I started off as a combat medic. I then did my NHS paramedic training. So I was able to get on the first register for paramedics in the UK. And what was then the CPSM, for Council for Professions Allied to Medicine, one of those. It's now the HCPC, so the Healthcare Professions Council. But in that time, I've qualified as a radiation protection supervisor. I have my full maritime radio operators qualifications. I qualified as a safety advisor and went through what we call NEBOSH, so the National Education Board for Occupational Safety and Health qualifications. I've done food hygiene. There's all of those additional bolt-on courses that make you more employable. So second pearl of wisdom is get more qualifications. Never stop training, never stop learning, because it will always be to your advantage.
Tim, I would say that people who are listening to this, there's going to be somebody that wants to work on an North Sea oil rig. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, you've got to get out there and you've got to sell yourself. And it's not going to come to you. You're going to need to go out and find it. There are definitely opportunities out there, but I can also tell you there's some pretty good medics out there too. So you're going to have a lot of competition that you're up against. And that's normal. I think that's normal for most jobs nowadays. There's a lot of people that are going to be going for the same job. But what you've got to be is the best candidate. And in order to be the best candidate, you're going to need to seek out employment, and you're going to need to want to do the job. But do your research. And really, that's the thing I think I could probably advise is do your research, go out there and find the job that best suits you, and interview and practice interviews. And if you're going to go for a job interview, please do not go in your jeans and t-shirt. Go with your best shoes, your best trousers, a shirt, a tie, and a jacket. Have all of your certifications with you. Have an up-to-date resume with you, and any information that you think might be relevant or you could get asked for. In other words, not only be the best candidate for the job, but look like you're the best candidate for the job.
Tim, we have a question from one of our potential students who is looking into our Bachelor's of Remote Paramedic Practice program. They're asking if they can get a job in the offshore industry with our quorum degree.
Yes, so that's a good question. Like I said earlier on, you've got to have a good base qualification. So if you are already a nurse, or you're already a paramedic, or you come from any of the services, so Navy, Army, Air Force, you're going to have a base qualification. But not everybody has had the opportunity or wanted to go through the military. There are people that may have come from things like I'm trying to think of students that we've had that have come from mountain rescue, so maybe already have some kind of involvement in medicine, in pre-hospital care provision, but want to take it to the next step. some people don't necessarily want to be nurses. They like the idea of being a paramedic, but they don't necessarily want to be driving around, in an ambulance. So what's the other alternative if you don't want to go through that process? And one of the obvious ones is getting a co-rom degree. Okay, that's going to sound biased because I'm a faculty member for the college, but one of the things that kind of brought me into doing this program as well, and kind of supporting it, is I think it's really important to have that base level of qualification, and the co-rom degree is going to do that for you. I mean, you can't essentially get most of these jobs nowadays unless you have some form of degree. Paramedic training, that's now a degree program in the UK. Nursing degree program, that's been around for a long time. So you're going to need to have at least 3 years of a good degree program. The nice thing about the college degree, the co-rom degree, especially in remote paramedic practice, is it's going to be covering all of those things and is going to set you up for working in a remote location, because that's how we orient the training. We orient the training into literally within the first year. We take it into a clinic-based type environment that could be a remote clinic somewhere in the jungle, or could be somewhere in the desert. It could be in Africa. It could be in any place really in the world. So we start that off certainly within the first year, but then we'll be taking people out onto the ground. And we put our students into resource poor environments, so they get used to having to think and become MacGyver medics. And I think that's also what you want, is you want a program, whatever choice you make or whatever program you decide you want to study, you need to look at the end goal. Where do I want to go with this, and how can I be best prepared? You've got to have that base qualification, and I think definitely the college degree in remote paramedic practice is up there. It's forefront, with the other degrees that you could potentially get either in nursing or in being a paramedic or any of the ex-services. So can I get offshore with a co-rom degree? Yes, you can. That will be a base qualification for you, which would then qualify you to be able to do an offshore medics course. Once you've done that, obviously you're going to need to do your offshore survival and firefighting. And also with that, you are going to need an offshore medical as well. Now, this is not just for the UK. The offshore medics course in the UK, I've certainly found open things up internationally for me as well. It's one of those courses that's kind of been seen as a standard, and the standard before you can get onto that course is having followed some form of degree in either nursing or paramedicine.
Tim, what different types of offshore installations are there? Are they all just drilling for oil?
Well, the answer is no, it's not just oil rigs. I think I've worked pretty much on every installation that there is within the oil and gas industry. So the fixed installations, so that's what we commonly known as the oil rigs. You have what we call semi-submersible. So you'll have an oil rig that essentially floats, but it's moored to the seabed, and sits on large pontoons that float. There's floating production, storage, and offloading, so FPSO. So that's essentially converted oil tankers or purpose-built installations that are essentially a boat. They're a floating installation, so they'll have a hull. And again, they will be moored to the seabed. I think it takes a special kind of person to work on an FPSO for the simple reason you need to have sea legs. So if you're thinking of working as an offshore medic and you don't have good sea legs, don't work on a floating production facility. We have other fixed installations that we might call normally unmanned or NUIs. So these are installations that don't have people living on board, but what people do is they'll go onto a helicopter, like with a maintenance crew, and they will fly to those installations. They'll do whatever maintenance work needs to be done during the day, and then they'll down-man it, so it will get left empty. So there's an awful lot of flying around. That can be a pretty good job, and I've actually done that as well because of the diversity. It's actually quite interesting. In terms of floating as well, installations, I mentioned guard vessels or supply vessels. Uh, they provide safety cover. So if there was an incident on board an installation, they would help with anyone that obviously had to abandon the installation. So you can work on those. Trying to think what else. I think that's about it. It's mainly fixed installations. You've got semi-submersibles, which are floating oil rigs. You've got floating production, storage, offloading, which is tankers. You might work on an oil tanker itself as well. But it's not just offshore in the middle of the sea. It could be drilling sites as well. That's another type of installation. So you could have a drilling rig. So the idea being is they actually drill for the oil. They'll lay down a subsea template, which is where the oil well will be, and then the oil rig usually comes along after they've done the drilling, and it gets constructed over the top of that so that the oil reserves can be extracted from the seabed.
Tim, have you ever been involved in a major emergency or major incident whilst working on an offshore installation?
When a lot of people think of offshore, they think of Piper Alpha. And we all know that Piper Alpha was one of the worst incidents that has ever happened offshore, certainly in the UK. And unfortunately, lives were lost as a consequence of fire and explosion on board the installation. So the answer to that question is yes. I was on a floating production and storage offloading facility. This was in 2012. And the facility itself had some maintenance issues. We'd had some leaks, and whilst they weren't major, it was necessary to do a lot of remedial work. The installation had to be shut down, but we still had oil reserve on board, so we still had some oil, etc., in our tanks. But during 2012, and I'm trying to think of the time of the year now, it would have been late in the year, so you can expect, certainly in the UK North Sea, some pretty bad weather conditions. So essentially in 2012, I think it was around April, May time, we probably had the worst storm. It was that kind of 50-year storm. So we were looking at a predicted between 60 to 100 knot winds. I think we had 50 meter seas. Maybe it was something like 70-foot seas. Either way, the vessel was moving up and down an awful lot. But the weather conditions actually got so bad that the vessel itself suffered significant damage. And we had a lot of containers, etc., on board at this time. So not only did we suffer storm damage from the waves, which actually took off some of the handrails around the deck, we had what we would call green water. So that means that the sea will actually swamp the deck. We actually had containers that because the roll of the vessel was so extreme, despite the fact we had containers that were fixed to the deck, the angle was so great that some of those containers slid across the deck and tore up the deck. We had containers on our roof that slid off of the one of the modules, which was where a lot of the power generation was. And when it was sliding off, actually it was a workshop container. It took out one of our emergency fire pumps. So it meant our firefighting capability was significantly reduced. Now, obviously, at this moment in time, all of the installation is on general alarm status. And I wasn't a medic at the time. I was actually one of the safety advisors. So I was actually the emergency response team leader, or the fire team leader. We had containers that had contained batteries. So we ended up with a small fire on deck because these were they had volatile chemicals in, and if they come in contact with air, then they can ignite. We could actually see on the video camera a small fire, but because We couldn't go outside. If we had committed any of the fire team members out on the deck, they would have probably been just washed overboard. So there was nothing we could do. We couldn't evacuate the installation. The best place to stay was actually on board. If we'd put lifeboats into the sea, then yeah, we were on the biggest lifeboat, so the best place to stay was actually on board the installation. But the aftermath of that, after at least 10 plus hours of violent movement, extreme roll, which caused significant structural damage to the installation. Thankfully, the fire was extinguished by a significant amount of water that was swamping the deck. Thankfully, we didn't have any gas releases. Most of that inventory had gone, but we did have oil on board. Although our tanks weren't full, as I recall, but that inventory was still there. One of the biggest issues we had was we had normally occurring radioactive material that we were cleaning from sand that we'd taken out of some of our tanks, because you get sand in oil. And a lot of that, along with chemicals, was also strewn across the deck. So there was that hazard as well. And the following morning, when we were able, as an emergency response team, to get out on deck to try and secure some of the things that had got loose so that they wouldn't cause any further problems, we identified we had quite a high kind of radioactivity from the normally occurring radioactive material that you find in sand and oil and gas residues, hydrocarbon residues. So we had that to contend with, as well as some corrosive chemicals that are used for getting air out of oil and gas, used for drying gas. So there were a significant number of hazards. I'd say that was the worst incident that I've been involved in. Thankfully, no injuries. Everybody remained safe, and we literally just had to ride out the storm. But I would argue it was one of the most scariest times of my life, because you really just don't know what's going to happen next.
Tim, thanks for talking with us today. Thanks for your input on what life is like with the offshore oil rig, and we will see you next time.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And again, if anybody has any questions, then please don't hesitate to contact me at my COROM address, and I'll try and offer as much advice as I possibly can when it comes to being the offshore medic. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
This has been a presentation from the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine Foundation. If you would like to earn CPD credit for this podcast, you can join the Council of Members. Being a member of the college gives you free CPD credits, free access to the virtual field guide, and discounts on our e-learning courses. You can join the team on the college website, which is corom, COROM, corom.org.